everyone, Christopher Paolini here again, and today I'm getting to have an awesome conversation with none other than the dynamic duo that makes up M.A. Carrick, author, or there should be like a plural word for a joint authorship of a book, but the author of The Mask of Mirrors, and of course both of you are authors in your own right. So we have Brennan and Alyc Helms. So welcome both of you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me
here. Yeah.
Now, your most recent book, The Mask of Mirrors, is kind of notable because it was the first book, I believe, that you've co-written and the most recent book that both of you have published, correct?
For me, technically that second
no,
one is not true.
Anymore.
2 weeks after The Mask of Mirrors came out, I had a book called The Night Parade of 100 Demons out, which you can see over my left shoulder here. And this is what happens when publishing schedules collide.
Oh, I didn't know that came out. I'm going to have to read that now.
It's a Legend of the Five Rings novel, so it's a tie-in for a game, but it's not one where you need to know the game setting. Basically, if Japanese history and folklore are interesting to you, then that book might be up your alley.
So is Musashi a character?
No, it's the setting is simply based on historical Japan, so a lot of the kind of like cultural elements and so forth are drawn from that without it being actual Japanese history.
For those who don't know, I recommend looking up the life story of the samurai Musashi. I say samurai, but he was a poet and a philosopher and all of these other things, because his life story kind of reads like basically like a Mary Sue. Like you would think,
God, yes.
You're like, no one lives this life. Well, no, he was raised by his uncle in a...
Yeah, wanders around challenging people to duels to become a more badass swordsman.
And never lost.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're here to talk about writing and world building and all of that good stuff. So I thought I'd kick us off with a question that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, and I'd be curious how both of you approach this. So the question is, when you're approaching, a world like you created in The Mask of Mirrors, or any of the other worlds that you create, are you starting with some sort of underlying philosophy? Or are you reading and learning lots of things in the world and continually saying, oh, that's cool, and I'd love to put these different pieces together, but at the same time, and seeing where they lead you, but at the same time, I know both of you at least well enough to think that you both have some very strong thoughts and feelings, and you've developed your own personal philosophies and all of that. So where does that come into play? Because there's a line between looking at something and saying, I'm going to describe it without judging it, but then you are still in the same sense, in the same breath, crafting your story, which says something to the reader.
Right.
So where, how does all of that interact for the two of you?
That's a complicated question, and therefore an interesting one.
That's why I've been thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I will say definitely the reading stuff about the world. Absolutely, both of us are in that vein. I don't remember where it was that I first described myself as an anthropological compost heap that stories sprout out of, but this is probably a pretty apt way of doing it. And yeah, both of us are anthropologists. We actually met on an archaeological dig in Wales over 20 years ago at this point, which is a terrifying thing to say. But at the same time, I like that you bring that up, because I will see authors sometimes where they put stuff into their setting and then they seem to disclaim all responsibility for it as if it was just there. And I'm like, but you're the one who chose to put it there.
That. Yeah.
Yeah. And for The Mask of Mirrors, I know that some of it was consciously chosen. We knew from the start that we wanted it to be a city that's in a kind of colonial situation, that about 200 years ago, they had been conquered. And technically, they're not being ruled by the conqueror that had gotten them in the first place. When that broke down, it broke down in a way that still favored the invading people. So they still very much hold power there. And so there were definitely things in the world building where we were thinking about that aspect of it and okay, how are we presenting this?
Well, and it's funny because I think for me, it has changed from book to book. So there are stories where I started from kind of a character and a character voice and kind of built everything around that. And this one actually kind of started from a group of characters.
Yeah, and the relationships
and the relationships between them. And so in a lot of ways, we had that as our core, and then we started developing and designing the world around it that would kind of be a good vehicle, an interesting vehicle for that kind of story of these characters and their kind of layers of deception, which, you know, you think deception, you think masks, and, you know, there's kind of this like Venetian carnival kind of masquerade ball flavor that we wanted to get. And so some of that just came, the world building came out of how do we create a new world that can still have those elements that we really want. And then because of our anthropological background, like how do we make that world feel real and lived in and not like it's a bunch of, you know, things put together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like the mask thing, I know that was one of the earliest ideas we had was, and this actually stems out of me being really irritated at like Dungeons and Dragons world building. I hate the way that D&D handles evil gods. That it's basically like, and evil gods have their churches and they're like openly worshipped and people are like, yay, evil. And like, that's not how it really works though. And so one of our first ideas was the faces and the masks in Versenian religion, where the idea is that each of those is a single deity that has a benevolent aspect and a malevolent one. And the malevolent side, it's not that you worship it in a like, you know, yay, warfare and hatred kind of way, so much as you try to propitiate it. Your worship is, may the mask not turn their attention to me and may I not be hit by those kinds of things. And so that was kind of like a philosophical ideal that out of the annoyance of D&D world building came this concept that fit in with, we just both like masks, so let's put that in the book. And then from that came a whole bunch of ideas about duality that are kind of like permeating different corners of the setting. And duality of the sort where it's each side kind of contains its opposite, because with the faces and masks, you see this in the way that the pattern cards are read. The faces in the wrong situation aren't great. Like, you know, love and peace, you know, one of the faces, but that can turn into there's conflict and we're just not talking about it, that, you know, many people have seen like in their families and such, that whole, maybe if we don't discuss the bad things, they'll go away, and that's not good. And similarly, the masks can be something where like, well, crime isn't great unless the system is so unjust that crime is the only way to kind of, you've got to step outside the system. So yeah, like things that started as shallowly as we like masks and I'm annoyed at D&D then ended up developing these implications.
Well, I mean, if evil gods such as that actually did exist and had actual influence over the world, it would make perfect sense to be giving them gifts and prayers in an attempt to keep them from wrecking your life. And then if they reward you in some way for your service to them, your worship of them, that's a slippery slope right there. But it makes perfect sense if there's actually some terrifying evil horned god who's going to, you know, curse your people and smite them down if you don't offer up your burnt offerings. Yeah. But going back to your anthropological background, so with everything you've learned about different cultures and history and all of that, do you ever have the sense or the opinion, personally, that is, not professionally, well, maybe it is professional, that some cultures in certain aspects just do things better? And then when it comes to your writing, how do you, I mean, does that judgment on your part influence how you approach things?
So there's a concept that both of us, you know, dealt with when we were. Do you want to give the cultural relativism?
You go ahead with cultural relativism. But yeah, I was like, I know exactly what you're going to say.
So there is this concept, cultural relativism, which sometimes gets misunderstood kind of by people outside of anthropology. And they will basically gloss it as, well, you can't criticize X thing because it's part of somebody's culture. And like, that's not what it means to anthropologists. What it means within the field is that you have to understand something according to the framework of the people who do it. Like, you have to see it or try to see it the way that they do. And so the example I often use to illustrate this is like human sacrifice in Mesoamerica with like the Maya and the Aztecs. And so
it's funny, I was thinking of that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's an easy one to go to because human sacrifice, not a good thing, right? And practiced in many parts of the world. It was just, you know, particularly like well recorded and noteworthy there. And, you know, certainly on a moral level, you look at that and go, this is evil. But the way that the people in that culture understood it was not "Mwahaha, we are evil, let's go kill people." That was not at all the sense of it that they had. And so cultural relativism says, well, how did they understand it? And what you start seeing is, number one, there were many kinds of sacrifice woven through the culture, of which killing somebody was the most like kind of extreme and high profile version of it, but there were many other forms of sacrifice, including self-sacrifice, where you would do things like you would pierce your earlobe or your tongue, or for men, actually the penis, and even drag like a thorned string through it to make it bleed more, to give an offering of your own blood to the gods. And when you look at the like mythology and cosmology, effectively what you find is a world where everything is paid for with sacrifice, that nothing comes for free, nothing comes without cost. And so these are things that you have to do in order to keep the cosmos functioning. And that's the cultural anthropology, like cultural relativism view, is you go, okay, this is how they understood it, as like, this is the like fuel that keeps the world going. This is what makes stuff happen in the world. Like, the earth did not bear fruit and the sun did not move in the sky until they were given offerings of blood. So, but it doesn't mean that you then say, well, they should have been permitted to continue cutting people's hearts out because it's part of their culture. I'm like, yeah.
I guess that. Sorry, after you.
Oh no, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I guess it's that exact point that I'm kind of driving at, which is, if you as authors are the gods of the world of your story, or at least we try to be, as flawed as we are, how do you balance that, as you say, the cultural relativism, which I think is essential to being a good author? You know, you have to be able to understand and empathize with whatever group or persons you're writing about, but yet you can't, at least I don't think you should necessarily completely abandon your own sense of self or what you consider, important.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gets into another anthropological concept, which is the idea of the emic and the edic, which is the kind of insider view versus the outsider view. And as authors, I think that you're totally able to, show from your character's perspective what the insider view is of things that they might be acceptable in that culture and might be commonplace or have a rationale behind it. But you, the author, are still kind of that omnipotent view, and you can use a variety of techniques, from showing different, opposing points of view, different people with different opinions, or kind of, constructing some classic comeuppance kind of things. I mean, there's a variety of techniques to kind of show that just because something is accepted by certain characters in world, or is an accepted practice in world, doesn't necessarily mean that you're like,
endorsing,
supporting that.
Yeah. And this is something that's come up a bit with the Rook and Rose books, because, we're idiots who signed ourselves up to invent everything twice, at least. Because for everything, it's like, here's how the Leganti do it, and here's how the Versenians do it, and then, well, in Nadejra, you got a lot of culturally mixed people, and so maybe there's a third version. Like, we really did twice the work we had to. But it does afford us some opportunities. Like, one of the things we know is going to really come up in the third book is that Leganti and Versenian families have very different views of family, and like what makes somebody your kin, and how they approach that. And one of the things we want to show is that both groups, like, there's benefits to it and there's downsides. And we really wanted to make it, this kind of goes back to the colonial situation. The colonial situation is not a good one, but that doesn't mean that everything about Leganti culture is inherently bad, right? And that everything about Versenian culture is inherently good. Because, like, Versenian family is very much about blood kinship and so forth, whereas for the Leganti, it's actually kind of like a contractual thing. And now with the Leganti, that means that they might just sort of cut somebody loose, like, pretty lightly by Versenian standards. But as, again, many people may know from their own personal families, blood family, not always super functional and great. And it's harder to remove yourself from that when it does get dysfunctional.
And it's more traumatic when you are removed from something like that, when you're ostracized. Whereas with the kind of contractual family, it is also kind of a found family situation. You can create your own families. One of the things I've seen a couple people really appreciate is something that we kind of set out definitely wanting to do, which is that we have a queer normative world where queer relationships and queer identities are just, they're normalized. They're standard. There's nobody like makes a big deal. And one of the things that often when people try to do this, they run afoul of is inheritance structures and inheritance systems, because there are a lot of inheritance systems that do depend on, man, woman, boff, and child. Offspring, yes.
Spawn.
There's spawning occurring. But, so one of the things that we did and kind of the Leganti structure gave us a great opportunity to do was to have marriage where the concern about inheritance wasn't a concern, which it often becomes when people try to have gay marriage in their feudalistic or their kind of contemporary worlds, because we could have an inheritance structure that wasn't based on fertility. Or on a particular kind of blood lineage or genetic lineage.
And I'll note the gay marriage part of it, or same-sex marriage part of it.
Same-sex marriage,
this part isn't necessarily, isn't what you saw in history, but with that idea that you can just adopt an heir, that's actually something that, it's not unrealistic. That's the way that I know at least Japan would often operate.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah.
Whenever you see lists of the oldest family-owned corporations in the world, and Japan's always at the top, and a lot of times it's because they do exactly that. The family will adopt usually one of the men who helps run the company, and
exactly.
They become the heir, even though they're not related by blood. And yet they're still family.
Exactly. Europe was much more hung up on if they're not really blood, the adoption wasn't quite as normalized there as I think it is, or that it was in Japan. I don't know how much it is right now. But so I mean, that kind of thing, we're still looking at a real world model, even if the same-sex marriage wasn't part of how it got operated in Japan. And I also wanted to go back to the thing that you'd said, Christopher, about the authors as the gods of the world, because that's something that's always fascinated me about fantasy, where you can take something I get fascinated by readers who assume that actually down at its core, every fantasy world is still here is a planet orbiting the sun in a heliocentric model, and that everything is fundamentally like our world, but then with this other stuff on top. And I'm but
enter Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, exactly. It can in fact be a disc on an elephant. We can do this, or 4 elephants. And Alyc de Bodard, since we were talking about Mesoamerica, her Obsidian and Blood trilogy, one of the things I love, it's set in pre-colonial Aztec society. And when the revered speaker of that polity dies, one of the things about the revered speaker is that he holds back the star demons. And so after the revered speaker has died, and when it's, okay, we don't have a new one yet, the main character looks up at the sky and the stars are just a little bit closer. And so I love that kind of thing. Yeah. But it's a double-edged sword because, depending on what things of, past belief or fantastical belief that you say, okay, let's take this as true, well, then what are the implications of that? Because some of them get sketchy pretty fast.
Well, it's one of those ideas that I've played around with writing a story like this is, someone in the modern day who's going through their life in a large city and ends up, I don't want to spoil the exact concept, but ends up stumbling through a series of events and discovering that there are supernatural elements to the world that this person was unaware of, and that sends their life careening off in a completely different direction. But then the problem is you have to say, well, those elements must have existed through all of time,
right?
And then you're living in, and then you have a completely different world. I mean, that's here's a very easy example: is if you look at Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I know we're dating ourselves here, but something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if you really say the vampires have existed and he's magical powers and stuff, then it wouldn't be as secret as everyone was pretending it was in that show. There would be videos on the internet. There would be, it'd be, funniest home videos and, oh, look at this vampire who tried to walk through the doorway and bounced off the warding spell or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it just, the world would be completely different.
Well, and to counter that, because I thought a lot about the kind of the secret world version of urban fantasy, and because I had to deal with that in my solo novels, how I wanted to approach that, because there was this kind of spirit world that was, there were a bunch of different things. I'm not going to go into it, but anyways, it's very complicated. But one of the things that I kind of took as my basis was there are things like scientific principles that we know to be well kind of supported that a large swath of people don't believe in, right? Global climate change, evolution. And so I think that for the kind of supernatural and superstitious things, I think you can play with the notion that just because there's proof on the internet doesn't mean that people will or won't believe it.
True.
But you know what, and that's a cool point, but I think what always trips me up with it is, so I like video games. I've always enjoyed playing video games. I try not to enjoy them too much or I'll never write another book, but but something you see, and actually this isn't just true of video games, this is true of any games, but video games are a great example for me. People will find the exploits and then they will exploit them shamelessly. And it's actually kind of cool that if you look at an old game that's remained popular, like one of the Mario games or something, what people have figured out you can do with the game is kind of bonkers, or Minecraft. A lot of the things that are possible in Minecraft these days started off as exploits and sort of have become part of the game's meta. And I have to imagine that if any sort of supernatural hacks were available in the real world, that there would be people who would be obsessively figuring out every single. I mean, those are your magicians, of course. Honestly, that's what science actually is. Science is us speed running the world.
Well, Alyc and I are in Pathfinder. We have unlimited minutes. Awesome.
Unlimited minutes.
Pathfinder, we're playing in a campaign that's the Kingmaker adventure path, and it's one where you're kind of running Sim Kingdom alongside doing your adventuring and such. And as soon as we got put in charge of this realm, we kind of looked at it and we're like, oh my god, there are all kinds of obvious ways to use basic low-level magic. Like, we put in a sewer system and put permanent continual effect wondrous items of purify food and drink on the sewer system, so that just instant sewage purification, and we don't have any pollution problems. Got a command word item, unlimited uses per day of plant growth, and you wander around the kingdom blessing every single field so that it produces 33% more crops for the next year. We're just like, every place in the setting would want to do things like this because okay, sure, people in power aren't necessarily altruistic, but if you can be getting more tax revenue out of your peasants and not having to worry about how much your city smells, then they might do it. I posted this to Twitter. I was like, what are some other suggestions that people have for things you could do with basic D&D magic? And Max Gladstone just responded with a GIF from Disney's Aladdin where I think it's the Sultan is holding a scroll and the scroll just unrolls to 15 feet long. And that was just his response.
When I read Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle, I got obsessed with the question of how do you ensure your money supply, the sanctity of your money supply in a world with magic. And I actually have a short story that I'm planning on writing in the world of Aragon about literally the reason my villain in the inheritance cycle ended up learning the most powerful word that controls all of magic was simply because he was trying to find a way to protect his treasury and the coin of the realm from being counterfeited by all these little, these tiny little magicians out in the boondocks who are wrecking the supply of coin. It would be a serious problem.
Well, and I think what you were saying earlier about kind of scientists as magicians, that you can kind of look to science to see kind of for the model for how you would handle that in a fantasy setting, because you'd be like, all right, well, let's figure out some magical encryption security type.
That's a cool idea.
I wish I could find it again. So I think it may not be on the internet anymore. I went looking recently and couldn't turn it up. But some years ago, I read somebody's analysis, economic thing of D&D type, world building, and they're like, okay, so here's the fundamental thing: D&D is a wish-based economy. Forget your gold pieces, platinum pieces, etc. Wish renders all of that shit irrelevant. Your actual unit of value is the wish. From there, what do you get? And I'm like, because you can generate arbitrary quantities of wealth pretty much by using that spell. And I mean, yes, it carries a component cost, but that's balanced for game purposes, not actual economic ones. The economy of D&D is
I remember reading a similar breakdown of Harry Potter, which, to be fair, I quite enjoy Harry Potter, but they were going into basically Gringotts and the whole thing with the amount of gold that Harry had and how the economy of the wizarding world works versus the Muggle world. And I think the result of all of that was that you could basically break the wizarding world's economy in about 3 days and make yourself an absolute fortune.
But I mean, as you said, you enjoy the books, and that is something to keep in mind here, is that like we don't have to build everything to hold up to actual real world stress test conditions all the time. Fundamentally, most readers are not there for like your economic dissertation. Baroque cycle notwithstanding, because I also read that and loved it, but like you pretty much have to be Stevenson to pull that off, I think. And
I think that's also related to the question that a lot of authors, I think, struggle with when they're writing secondary worlds, which is how much of our real world kind of stuff are you borrowing versus how much are you making up, versus how far does the rabbit hole go down? Because the potato is like one of the big examples where like people are complaining, oh, this is like a medieval Europe thing, but they had potatoes and that wouldn't have happened until a certain time.
Like, but it's not actually Europe, so who gives a shit?
But it's not Europe, so who gives a shit? And then you start thinking, okay, well, so what are the kind of trade implications of, does this place that I'm setting this in have a lot of trade, and how does the trade work? But then you start even thinking on it's a question of, as a world builder, how deep do you want your rabbit hole to go before you realize that the rabbit hole is leading right back to our world?
Yeah.
Because we are, a dog is a dog is a dog. And yes, there is actually a specific kind of evolution of dogs and dog species and everything like that, that has like a very embedded historical context that is not true to your world. But you just want to have a dog.
So that actually brings up something so 2 points. One, something I was going to mention over the course of this conversation was exactly sort of this point, which is, I think for people who watch this, especially if they're aspiring writers themselves, I think it could probably be overwhelming to just hear about this endless detail we discuss and all the things that we think about or that you can think about. And it's true. I mean, you could spend 30 years on one world and one story. I mean,
I would get so bored, though.
Tolkien kind of did that. But yeah, you get bored, and I think you would go insane, quite honestly. But at the same time, at least for me, I want to tell certain stories. That's what drives all of this. And all of this world building is to support the story and not to take away from it. If anything, it's just to make it feel more authentic and interesting and emotional. But anyway, the second point was that actually just a question, which is about the dog. Have either of you, I'm sure you must have, but have either of you read Gene Wolfe?
I've read a little bit of stuff, not much.
So I haven't read enough.
Castleview, I think, is what I read, yeah.
Okay, so I haven't read enough to know if I actually like him or not, but he's interesting.
Yes, I am right there with you.
So with like Shadow of the Torturer and that series, which I avoided because the main character is a torturer, I thought I don't want to read about torture. And fortunately, he does not really put you into that. And he has his reasons for doing that, very Catholic reasons, I think. But what he does in that series is really cool because it's science fiction, but it's not immediately obvious. And he will mention creatures like a dog or a horse simply so that, because that's how his characters would think about it, but it's not the horse it's not the dog and he'll use these Latin names for stuff that I just, it's a really interesting approach of not trying to come up with a new word for something that actually is very different.
I want to say, I think it's Cameron Hurley did something recently, and now I'm trying to remember which book it is, and I'm like Googling it as we speak. But one of her more recent series, I think it did something similar where she used our understanding of what these things were to introduce things that are not actually those things, but that's the position they hold in her secondary world.
Which is an interesting inversion of, there's an old phrase that you'll hear people use sometimes about calling a rabbit a schmearp. And it basically is a way of referring to the types of stories where, like, here you have this small, soft-furred, long-eared, herbivorous creature that, runs very quickly and hops around, and you call it a schmearp to make your setting seem more fantastical. And you're talking about the inverse of that, where you're like, yes, here is my dog and it's 6 legs and also it breathes underwater, like, but it serves the role of a dog in my life, and so I call it my dog or whatever. It's an interesting flip of that idea.
Well, and then you get into what do we mean when we say dog? Because it's a dog like a
is a Chihuahua really a dog?
No.
Like, why is it that not a yeah?
It's a rat. Well, and I think it's what effect you want to have on the reader too, because in Wolf's case, I think a lot of what he plays with is the unreliable narrator and giving the reader a sense of being off balance at times, and doing that exact sort of thing helps achieve that goal. But it's hard because the same that product of the rabbit, for example, because if you write something in the modern world and you say the character walks down the street past the McDonald's, past the Starbucks, and goes into the subway, you don't have to explain what any of that means. But if you're writing speculative fiction, you maybe should, if you don't want to confuse your readers, but there's a large part of me that doesn't want to explain that.
You're preaching a bit to the choir.
I was going to say, you're speaking our language, man.
yeah, because it has been interesting seeing how readers react to the world building in The Mask of Mirrors, because
and how we deploy and describe the world building, or don't, is the case maybe.
Because there's 2 challenges here, and this is something I've been chewing on a lot in recent years. Of there's your world building, like the content of what exists in your world, and then there's the exposition of how do you communicate that to the reader. And I've gotten really interested in the ways that we do that and how to do it more gracefully, because like anybody who's done like even small amounts of writing has probably come across the term info dump, where it's I'm going to stop the story dead to lecture you, the reader, about he walked past the McDonald's, which was a fast food restaurant, meaning that the food was cheap but not very good. However, it was delivered quite quickly, and that kind of thing. And that's clearly not good. But
I don't know. You were 3 steps from Raymond Chandler right there.
Yeah.
Well, and I will say, like with the info dump, beginning writers get told, oh, don't info dump, it's bad. And I'm like, unless you do it well enough, because Neil Stevenson will info dump like a mofo, but he is so entertaining while he does it that you will just or at least I will eat it up with a spoon. He doesn't work for everybody. But if the voice is good enough, some readers will be like, all right, roll on, tell me all about this. Yeah. So that is one of the ways you can sell the exposition. We try to go the route, and this again works for some readers better than for others, where it's just the manner in which we introduce those terms. Okay, he walked past the McDonald's and the Starbucks, and we'll describe maybe the smells wafting out of them that tell you, these are places that serve food and coffee.
Or talk about the horrible summer they spent working there.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing.
Yeah. And I think Joe Walton was the one who coined the term incluing, for just salting in the little details in the text that will, without ever stopping and telling you this is what this is, it will, if you've got a particular type of sword that exists in your setting, rather than saying this, which was a sword, you have your character put their hand on the hilt of that as it's at their hip, and the reader's going to go, that is probably a type of sword. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, but it is a style of exposition that requires the reader to kind of not just be skimming and reading quickly and not paying attention to how you introduce those details. Yeah. And, sometimes you don't want to have to pay attention while you're reading. You just kind of want to turn your brain off and run with a nice beach read.
And the other thing that that sort of thing lets you do is drop in things that make the world feel much bigger than it actually, much bigger than the page. Because with an info dump, you're here's everything right on the page. But if you just in passing mention this folk tale, and you don't ever kind of go into the details of the folk tale, but you give just this mention and then and how it relates to whatever's going on, and then you move on, the world feels bigger even if you've never actually kind of worked out the entire version of the folk tale. And I personally am a huge fan when I read a book and there's an epigraph from a book that doesn't exist, or it mentions a historical a historical conflict between these two academics. I love those kinds of things because it makes the world feel bigger and richer.
Sarah Manette's Doctrine of Labyrinth series that starts with Melusine is just a masterclass in that kind of thing. Like, she is so good at mentioning, like, oh, this like famous play or this historical figure or whatever, where maybe they only get mentioned once, but it's done in such a fashion that you get the flavor you were supposed to get without feeling like you have to know more. Which doesn't mean there aren't readers who are like, wait, what is this? Why didn't you tell me more about it? Wait, I don't understand.
What?
Yeah. And so, like I said, it's partly a matter of reader taste, what's going to work and not.
Yeah. Well, and styles change over time.
Yes.
I was always had this sort of impression in my head that Dune was this big info dumpy book. After reading it as a teenager, and I went back and revisited it at one point as an adult, and I was actually shocked by how much he doesn't explain. And so there's a lot of these references of just, this corporation or this technology, and he doesn't really delve into any great detail. And yet I think the book has this impression of being incredibly dense and heavy, which is partly earned.
Yeah. I remember, watching the David Lynch movie of it. And first of all, the first time I saw the movie, I was like half asleep and all the way across the room. And so I did not get it because I was not super awake to begin with. But then, later on, I saw this version that, like, some fan-made version that I forget how long it was. But basically, it gets to, like, okay, the first time Thufir Hawat appears on screen, and it freezes, and there's, like, a voiceover that says, this is Thufir Hawat. He's a mentat, which is a human computer, which blah, blah, blah. And it proceeds to just explain everything to you rather than flinging you into the deep end and expecting you to swim. But honestly, like, I've come around to being somebody who likes that feeling of I am now immersed in this and you're not feeding it to me one bite at a time.
Yeah. I think of it almost like, it's like travel. You can either, go to a country with a tour group and the guide who's going to tell you all the context of all the nice, interesting things that you saw and take you on the path. Or you can get dumped on the doorstep of the cousin of your college roommate who's like, I know everything, but I'm not going to know how to describe it to you. I'm just going to take you to the McDonald's or the Starbucks or whatever.
I kind of have literally almost had that experience. When I went to India, I wanted to buy a sari. And so I talked to a good friend of mine from childhood who's Indian. And I was like, hey, what advice do you have for me? And the next thing I know, I'm being put in touch with her brother's girlfriend's aunt who lived in the city that we were going to, and she shows up to take me out sari buying. And I'm just like, I am definitely in the deep end here, being just like hauled around to, this is where she gets her saris from, and now we go to this lady who will cut off the bit at the end to make it into the little blouse for it, and we got to go get you jewelry. Just wow, it was a very different experience from going to where tourists normally buy their saris.
Yeah. Well, so I think that's our philosophy of like world explanation, info dumping.
The most extreme version. I mean, I'm sure that people have done more extreme, but one of the most extreme versions I've seen of this done consistently is actually C.J. Cherryh with her work, because boy, she really takes it to the extreme with her limited third person. And I sort of have a love-hate relationship with reading her books, because I'll read them and get frustrated, but I keep going back to read them because it tickles my brain in this really interesting way. Yeah. For those who don't know, she will do things like the main character's friend may be an alien, but she will not, C.J. Cherryh will not tell you that character is an alien until you're halfway through the book, because the main character has no reason to think of the fact that this other person is an alien.
It reminds
of Nicola Griffith's Hild, because it's also got, like, the character ages up through it. So it's also got the character's ability to understand things as a child, and then as they get older, like their ability to understand things kinds of.
Yeah, though she will also do things, and like I still haven't finished that book because it is a beautiful read, and it's one that I'm sort of leisurely floating my way downstream through it, as opposed to feeling like the currents really got hold of me. There was one scene, right, that really stuck in my mind, that the two, like the main character and her sister, I think, are talking about some issue of, politics or whatever. And they're doing it while they are, like, skimming the cream off of the milk to make, then go churn the butter and so forth. And the extent to which the entire process of butter making in medieval England gets described to you in this scene, because it is the lovingly detailed backdrop to this small piece of information information that is actually being conveyed. I'm like, if you want to feel what it is like to live in medieval England, then there you go. Like, go read Hild. But it is also going to be an extremely immersive experience relative to the amount of plot momentum happening.
My family and I had sort of a interesting experience with getting dumped into a story. I think I've talked about this in an interview or two once before, but when we watched the rebooted Battlestar Galactica, we were watching it on, I think it was DVD or something. Yeah, I think we were getting it from Netflix or something. Back when we had a DVD subscription from Netflix.
Yeah.
But so the way that the show operated, I'm probably going to get the exact order wrong, but they started with some sort of brief recap of the previous episode. And then they had, and then usually, with shows, you have your recap and you have your credit sequence and then the episode starts. And so we found, you can just use the scene skip and you get into the episode. And so we would watch like the first 3-4 episodes after the mini series like that. And we were like, boy, this is just really interesting storytelling. It's just dumping us right in the middle of the story, not explaining how we got there, what's going on. And it was really fascinating, actually, because we felt like the writers were trusting us in a way that most shows don't. And then we found out that what the show was actually doing was a recap, a small bit of the new episode, and then a whole credit sequence and opening sequence, and then the rest of the episode. But I'm so glad for that opportunity because it really did tickle the brain in an interesting way.
I had this recently. Juliet Wade is a friend of mine, and her first book, Mazes of Power, came out last year. But it's this kind of like dystopian sociological science fiction. And I was like, I want to read Juliet's book. I have Juliet's book, but I'm not sure I'm really quite up for it. And then late in the year, I get pinged by her publisher saying, hey, would you be willing to blurb the second book? And I'm like, yes, okay, I will read the first book, and then I will read Transgressions of Power, and shit, I'm running out of time. We're reading Transgressions. We'll get to Mazes later. And so I jumped in on the second book, which my comment to Juliet, and this was sort of in the review I posted on my blog, that I consider it a testament to how good of a story it is that I got sucked in while madly dog paddling to try and stay afloat, as I'm like, I have no idea who any of these people are or what the hell this society is or how any of this works. There's a bunch of different casts and stuff, and paddle. But it was a great story, despite me having willfully missed the beginning where, I think it probably still was going to be a steep dive into the setting, but it was steeper than it was meant to be for me.
Well, I think one of the advantages of sometimes bypassing the beginning of a story is it gives you an unconventional structure or feel to a story that would be difficult to do by accident, or difficult to do on purpose, I should say. I got into fantasy because I picked up a David Eddings book, and it was when I was like 8, and it was the second book of a trilogy, and I didn't realize.
Sorcery? Or no, not, you said a trilogy, so you were probably reading the Diamond Knight, Ruby, whatever.
Yeah, the Ruby Knight. The Diamond Throne is the Ruby Knight. It was the Ruby Knight. In fact, I think I've got it right here.
I did the same thing with David Eddings, just with a different series. I picked up the second book of the Belgariad, having skipped the first one.
And I didn't realize it was this. I was a stupid kid. I didn't realize it was the second book until I was like this close to the end. I was like, how is he going to end all of this in just these few pages? And but it worked really well, and it makes me want to do a story like that where it is a standalone novel, but you approach it as if we're partway through the grander adventure.
And I think there are some ways that we've seen people do that, like a maybe not terribly successful example, Star Wars, like starting off with, the whole episode 4 to give you that feeling of the larger story. And there have been plenty of authors who went back and wrote prequels, though I think, some of them succeed and some of them don't. Sort of accidentally creating that experience. There's a not terribly well-known author named Daniel Keyes Moran, whose books I love. Purely through accident, like my sister and I can't remember which of us even found the book originally, but at Half Price Books, way back in the day, we're in like high school, we found The Last Dancer, which is one of his novels, and we grabbed it and we read it, and that was great, and that's the third book in the series. So then we tracked down the second one, and we read The Long Run, and then we finally tracked down the first book and read Emerald Eyes, and And that's not the complete series, actually. It's an ongoing thing that he will probably never finish, but each book kind of does its own thing enough that it's not a horrible thing not to finish it. But it gave it this really fascinating feeling, almost like a Greek tragedy, because you read The Last Dancer and there's this backstory of this horrible stuff that happened. And then you read The Long Run and you get a character who was like old enough during those horrible things to kind of have had a first person view of them in a way that the character in The Last Dancer hadn't. And then you finally read Emerald Eyes and you're just sitting there going, oh, this is all going to end so badly. I know that. And now let's watch it play out.
I was horrified to discover a friend of mine read the Narnia books in chronological order, not publishing order. And apparently that's how the books
started with Magician's Nephew, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And apparently this is how the books are packaged now. In chronological order.
I massively disagree with. Yeah,
massively disagree with. Exactly. For that very same reason. I was introduced to Mervyn Peake in a used bookstore. I stumbled across Mervyn Peake. No one had told me of his work. I had never learned anything. That's what used books.
Weird.
That's what used bookstores are good for. But but I found the third book, which is Titus Alone.
Titus Alone.
And now everyone likes to hammer on Titus Alone, but for one reason, it was actually massively butchered after his death. Mm-hmm. And if you buy the modern omnibus edition,
which is what I've got,
it has the full version of the book.
Yeah.
But I opened it up. This was actually when I was touring for the self-published edition of Aragon. I was in Galveston, Houston, in this tiny little bookstore on the ocean. There was a pelican right outside the front door, and I find this book right next to the Marquis de Sade's work for some strange reason. It was a weird store. Anyway, so I pick up Titus Alone. I start flipping through it, and I'd never heard of Mervyn Peake, and it was so strange. It was like a fever dream, and it caught me in a way that's hard to explain. So then I bought it. I got the other books, and I read through up to the third book. And the weird thing is, the third book did not strike me the same way after having read the first two. Like, just taken in isolation, it was perfect in some weird way.
Yeah.
Well, because I was going to say, because you don't really get Steerpike's development is like where you get the first book. Yeah, right. That would be interesting.
Yeah, well, Titus Alone is when he's left Gormenghast, if I remember correctly.
He's gone.
So it's just it's off doing its own thing entirely.
Yeah, he's off in the city and everything's going horribly wrong for him.
Yeah. And I think there's also an element of when you're younger, you're a little bit more willing to kind of do that. I've been thrown into the deep end of an incomplete story because that's kind of your experience of the world, right? There's all this stuff around you that you don't necessarily really know how it started, but you learn to navigate your way through it. And I do think there may be a tendency for us, as we get older, to kind of want more explanations and want to know the story from the beginning, and to be more likely to put a book down if it's this is the third in the series. I don't know how it began, so meh. Whatever, and we'll just stop.
I think that's great. I think that's an awesome point. And I was going to say earlier, one of the great things with world building to get around some of the issues we talk about with info dumping is to have a character who doesn't know any of this stuff. The innocent abroad, so to speak.
Well, and I wanted to loop back to that, so thank you for playing right into that. Alyc, you mentioned that with Hild, she's growing up through the course of the book, and so you kind of get introduced to stuff as Hild comes to understand it more. And same with the general naive protagonist. I think this was one of the reasons you got so much of the rural farm boy gets thrown into bigger event structure of things, because that helps you explain the bigger world, because you've got the character who needs to have those things explained to them, and the reader learns alongside the character. But what's interesting to me is that there are other ways of working in that information without doing the naive protagonist, because after a while that gets a little old. You start being I want to have the character who's already settled and competent in what they do, rather than always starting from the beginning of someone's journey. And I've kind of been stumbling over ways to do that completely by accident, because I don't realize that's what I'm doing until I've done it. The Memoirs of Lady Trent, because it's the sort of first-person narration where she's an old lady now and she is consciously writing her story for an audience. Being able to use that consciously framed narration meant that I could drop in things where she'll be now younger readers won't understand this, but back when I was young, here's how the world was. And I could put in that exposition in a way that made it characterization for her as well. Or then and I can't remember who it was that specifically commented on this, and I went, oh, that is what we're doing. I am going to pretend we did that consciously and on purpose, that because Ren is a con artist in The Mask of Mirrors, she's constantly sort of like weighing the angles of, okay, what can I leverage here? And here's what I know that I am hiding the fact that I know it, or I've got to pretend that I know this thing and get them to explain it to me or whatever. Yeah. Because she is calculating in that fashion, we're able to use that. We actually had the original intention that her personas were going to be more sort of firewalled from each other, that like when she was Renata, she was going to be thinking much more as Renata. And I think we got like partway into the Gloria in chapter 2 and went, nope, we need to be able to use her knowledge of the way the city really works to explain things to the reader.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's other techniques for doing it, and I've been sort of accidentally tripping over them one after another.
And every book is a different challenge.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
I mean, do you think that there is an element of, I'm not quite sure how to articulate this. I mean, if you think about what human life has been like historically, prior to the Industrial Revolution and such, there certainly were periods of great change, but you could point to large chunks of human history where wherever you were born is pretty much where you died. Right. Your life, I don't want to say it was static, but the technology was static or mostly static. The social structures were static. And that's certainly not the world we live in today. And I mean, I remember hearing stories from my parents who, in my eyes, are still not that old. But, my mom, she grew up with black and white televisions and got to see the space race and all these other, and my dad's a few years older and all of that. And they got to see the development of computers. And now I'm starting to get old enough. I mean, the 90s feel like a different country,
Yeah.
They really do.
Pre-cell phone, pre-internet, like BBS era. Yeah.
So it's almost like we're all living through culture shock every decade or so. And because the thing is, we get this nostalgia for the way it used to be because it really has changed massively. And a lot of us move around the country, and that sense of history and stability is gone in many ways. And I think perhaps that's one reason why people are drawn to fantasy sometimes, because it offers a little bit of anchoring to the past.
Well, and I think there's also an element of our world has gotten sufficiently cosmopolitan that the number of different like cultures and ways of thinking and so on that you get exposed to just in, your daily interactions. And it can be really difficult to wrap your mind around how much like narrower the scale for that used to be. There's actually something that I sort of love in the first book of The Wheel of Time, where main character grows up in this tiny little village called, in this area called the Two Rivers. So he's in this village of Eamon's Field, and there's like 4 villages in this area, and boy howdy do the Eamon's Fielders have opinions about like those people from Terran Ferry. They cannot be trusted. And then the characters get out into the bigger world, and oh my god, like that's the tiniest little like bubble of the world they could have possibly been in. But then also I'll read real history. I was reading something about pre-colonial, the just San Francisco Bay Area. And there was this map of the number of different languages that were spoken just in the San Francisco Bay Area and how rapidly they became mutually unintelligible to each other within this area that's really, really small. So yeah, the extent to which you would probably live your entire life in an area where the degree of difference between you and the most different people you encounter is quite small. Though also in some ways larger than we think, because you got those bigger variations over a smaller geographical area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard, I think it was N.K. Jemisin, if I'm saying her name correctly, who wrote the other series that's called the Inheritance Trilogy. But anyway.
You probably get a lot of Google alerts for her books and her
not too bad. I actually have a signed book from her making a joke out of it, which was nice. Which was lovely of hers. But she made a point in some interview about how often sometimes the greatest cultural differences are seen between 2 groups that are living cheek by jowl, where the peoples are basically defining themselves as what they are in comparison to the other group.
Exactly.
Well, they're like that, so we're going to go completely the other direction.
Yeah. We do kind of have a deep-seated like monkey brain thing of there's got to be my monkey tribe and your monkey tribe, and they are different things. It's a hard impulse for us to overcome.
So with Mask of Mirrors, what did both of you feel like, if anything, that you learned about world building and writing from the process of creating that story?
On the writing front, I would definitely say both of us kind of had to learn how to plan and outline more than we normally would, which was, I think, a result of two factors. One was simply the fact that it is a collaboration, because normally when I'm writing a book, I've got this like vague, evolving story cloud in my head that like grows as I get ideas and, morphs and mutates and such. And that doesn't work when there are two heads. Like I cannot beam the cloud directly into Alyssa's skull, so I've got to talk about it. And I've got to make sure that I know what the cloud looks like in Alyssa's head. And then also just anything with this sheer quantity of intrigue and lying and different plot lines that need to tangle together later on, there's no winging that.
Yeah.
Or if there is, it goes over the course of like 17 drafts, and we did not want to spend that many years writing the damn book. So we had to learn.
Here.
Yeah, we had to learn how to plan. World building wise.
I mean, I think one of the things you brought up earlier was having to kind of come up with a two of everything.
It's like we had twins.
I don't know if it was so much like we learned anything, but we got a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Kind of considering and using our anthropological background to kind of be like, all right, so if these people are doing it this way and these people are doing it this way, kind of drawing from their initial worldview to kind of understand how that would play out in a variety of ways, but then also play out in a collision of cultures, like, we were saying, the kind of defining themselves against each other, how certain practices would become kind of more deeply embedded or exacerbated or change over time. I think we got a lot of practice doing that.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
Which was pretty fun.
Yeah, and for me, the Patreon that I've been running, which Christopher, I know you're familiar with, it's all about world building, and what I've been doing is like basically every week for over 4 years now, it's been here's a different facet of culture and what you can do with it in terms of different ways different cultures have approached it, and could do things like this in a story. And one of the things that I talk about there is that it's not that I expect any author to, hit every single thing that I have ever mentioned in an essay, because the checklist would never end, but that when something comes up in a story, to kind of, rather than just reaching for the immediate stock casting answer of, okay, here's how I'm going to describe that, maybe take a moment and think about how could this be different? What might be more interesting and more flavorful? And that's something where, like, I had thoughts about that, but if you look at what I'd actually been publishing, the Memoirs of Lady Trent, I call it kind of like world and a half, because it's a secondary world. It's not our world, but it is very clearly based on our world. Like Skirland is basically England, except everybody's Jewish, that kind of thing. And so I was doing more let me read up on real world cultures of this kind of environment and draw on that, as opposed to making things up from whole cloth. And prior to that, it was the Onyx Court books, which are set in English history. And so it was very much what was done in the period. I think both of those things were good for making me notice stuff that had flown under my radar before. The example I love to give for this is when I was writing Midnight Never Come, the first of the Onyx Court books, and I got to go do a research trip to London, which was really fantastic, but I had already written part of the book before I went. And I had a scene set at Hampton Court Palace where these two characters were, walking down a corridor, having a conversation, and then out onto a balcony. And I get to Hampton Court Palace and I look up and there are no balconies anywhere. And then I talked to the guy who was sort of guiding me around the place, and I realized in the Elizabethan period, no corridors. Rooms just open directly one onto the other. And I just had this mind blown. I took corridors for granted. But they don't always exist. So I'd had all these thoughts about paying attention to those little things and how could they be different. The Mask of Mirrors is the first time I've really gotten to put that into practice, to say all of these different things, the food and the clothing and the idioms and the, how do they structure the clock and the calendar and everything. And, let's do it. Let's see if I can actually put what I'm talking about into practice.
And I think for that, it was fun and useful. And I don't think we laid this out explicitly at the beginning, but I think we kind of had an understanding that slowly kind of evolved and solidified of the two different kind of worldviews of the two cultures and where they came from and how they were different. Because once you have that as your kind of rubric, then you can kind of start to say, okay, well, if this is their fundamental belief of the world and how it works, you can kind of let it cascade from there, because it'll inform everything from business to marriages to clothing to, idioms to yeah.
And by worldview, I think probably I might even almost talk about it more as like what's sort of the central image that's like the root from which things are going to spring. Because for the Leganti, one of the first things that we came up with for them was this magic numinatria that's based on like sacred geometry and numerology. And the religion that we built around, okay, well, if that's the magic they do, how does this work with their religion? It meant that they wound up being this like very structured and geometric, and things are built around the number 10 because that's how numinatria works. And so their currency is decimalized, the clock is decimalized, the calendar is decimalized. Yeah. All of those things are springing from that very rational, here is the Godhead, and it kind of unfolds itself sort of like the Sephiroth into, these different components.
And when their gods get angry, do they get decimated?
Oh.
Ouch.
Yeah. And then on the Versenian side of things,
there's a lightning just drops on you right there.
I was trying to head Alyc off at the pass because they also make puns all the time, and I'm like, no. We're the Versenians, we knew we wanted to have this divinatory card deck, and kind of the moment we settled on pattern as the name for it, I don't know if Alyc is laughing over the pattern stuff or over coming up with a pun.
I was just gonna say I don't do things by halves.
So
this is what I was trying to stop.
I'm currently, not to derail this too much, I'm currently playing my first RPG game with a group of people, which I've never done before, ever. And I'm playing a punomancer.
Oh.
So the premise is, here's the premise. Yeah. Okay, for his magic to work, he has to be able to make the enemy groan from a pun. And the worse the pun is, the stronger the spell.
So this is very important. I need to make sure my husband does not watch this interview because he will make that character.
Now what I'm curious about is there any kind of like bonus or boost you get from like a pun battle, like the kind of rally thing where you just kind of keep going back and forth on a particular like, it's almost like a poetic battle where you've got a particular topic and you're making puns on that topic, carrying on the conversation, which is my favorite kind of pun. So I'm just curious.
I tried doing that, but I discovered that after a certain number of puns that the god of this universe, aka the DM, gets too annoyed, and then the punomancy starts to backfire badly.
See, clearly what we need is, no, we do not need this. The world would die for Alyc to run the game where you play this kind of character.
Yeah. I was going to say, there's like a built-in like consequence.
I'm actually very much planning on writing a story about a punomancer, and this is specifically for my editor at Tor, Davey, who is not a fan of puns in the way I am. So I'm dedicating this one for her. I'm sorry, I derailed you.
That's okay.
I'll just finish up with the pattern thing, because I think when we say like, the worldview, it's helpful to give a concrete example of what we mean by that. So yeah, we had this deck and we decided we were going to call it a pattern deck, and literally like 5 seconds later, textile metaphors had taken over Versenian culture. And so a lot of stuff is built on that idea of threads and knots and things being woven together, and that's kind of the underlying concept that informs how we come up with stuff for Versenian, for their side of things. So when we say, worldview, it doesn't have to be like, you have studied Buddhism and thus you are thinking about the cosmology of Buddhism, though you could do that. Or, I mentioned Mesoamerica before. If your starting concept is everything carries a price, there is sacrifice in everything, then speaking from experience, once you get that mentality into your head, it's hard to get out again. I played a character like that for a long time in a game that Alyc was one of the people running it. And I could actually say it's Ree, the character you see in the Varkai novellas. And once you get a blood magic framework into your head, every time you're writing a completely different story, you're like, okay, how do we make this big effect achieved? Blood. I'm like, not everything is blood.
Well, that reminds me. So I have a question for both of you, which is something I like to ask every author I get a chance to speak with, because I don't know, I find it interesting. I find it interesting with my own work. And so that question is there a certain image, feeling, theme, character, anything in particular that you find yourself returning to again and again at the core of the stories that you personally want to write? And the reason I ask this specifically, aside from being interested in this, is because when I asked this of Robin Hobb, she looked straight at me and completely deadpan said, blood. Blood. She finds blood and the symbology and all sorts of things associated with blood very interesting. Everyone else has a different answer. For Brandon Mull, it was doorways, gateways, portals to other worlds, which you see again and again in his work. So for the two of you, individually or together?
I think for me, it would probably be, and you know, with the Mask of Mirrors, everybody's going to say, oh, we are terribly shocked. We can't see this at all. Identity, especially as reflected through names. Like, that's a thing I go back to a lot, to the point where I sort of have to, like, ration it a bit. I'm not allowed to give every character, like, oh, and this name was deliberately chosen for these important magical meanings or whatever. And I think a chunk of it might be just, you know, the stuff I was reading growing up. One of the things I imprinted on at a pretty early age was the ElfQuest comic book series, where number one, you've got the Wolf Riders. They specifically pick their names you might have a childhood name and then the name that you get when you're older, or your name might change when some big life event happens. But names, which you see in other fantasy things as well. And so, like, it shows up a lot in my stuff of, obviously, the Mask of Mirrors. It's not just that Ren has multiple identities, but that the name being used for her in the narration changes depending on who she's pretending to be. Even like Night Parade, not that there are like massive identity issues. For the most part, Yotora has some trouble there. But again, because it's something where you choose your name at adulthood in that society, and I speak enough Japanese that the names of the main characters in that, I can tell you exactly how they're written in Japanese and what the meaning of them is. And that's actually significant with one of the characters and with the name of the village and so forth. So yeah, names and identity is probably one I go back to a lot.
Yeah. And I think for me, it would be sort of similar, but on a slightly different kind of register, which is liminality and characters who are kind of have a foot in multiple worlds, or foot in two worlds, two identities, two kinds of understandings of themselves, like a lot of kind of, just like a lot of liminality around characters and the way they approach the world. And that also includes kind of trickster characters. I'm a big fan of tricksters.
Just a wee bit.
Same. I think every author ought to have at least one trickster character that they can have pop up around the edges of their stories. I read a lot of. We have a small. I think it's a Carnegie library here, and they have a lot of books from the early part of the settlement of Montana, and so I read a lot of Native American myths and legends that were collected from the area when I was growing up. And I always enjoyed the trickster coyote and reading about the problems he was causing and solving, but usually causing, because that's what tricksters do. So I know I asked this the last time we spoke, but for those who didn't get a chance to see that conversation, when is book 2 coming out?
It is currently slated for November.
This year?
Yes, this year. Yeah.
Yep. So fans are not going to have to wait too long to find out what happens.
And the title is The Liar's Knot, which it's another card from the pattern deck. Like the Mask of Mirrors is the card of like secrets and lies. The Liar's Knot is the card of trust and betrayal.
And so this is going to be a nice short book, right? Only about 50,000 words long, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because we've dealt with everything practically. I mean, what plot is left?
Right. Just a little epilogue.
I will say, however, there's probably at least twice as many capers.
Yeah.
Like we upped the caper quotient.
I hope there's a commensurate increase in capes as well, because capes are cool.
I mean, the book still has
coats than capes, but but they're very swingy coats. They're like cape-like coats.
But no, we get to do some fun things in The Liar's Knot because, you know, the Mask of Mirrors, there are certain things that we're deliberately not revealing to the reader until the end. And so the big game we had to play there was, how do we control the flow of information such that the reader knows what we want them to know? You get into the second book and the reader knows almost everything. And now it's the reader gets to enjoy.
The characters don't know. And it's enjoying, like, you know, when you get like two characters in the scene and each of them have a part of a secret that they're keeping from each other, and watching them kind of dance around that. We get a lot of enjoyment out of putting characters with different levels of knowledge
we might have made a list of like, okay, so Ren has these various personas, and here's the other people around her, and some of them have multiples as well. Can we make every permutation of these meet at some point during the novel? And I think we pulled it off.
I think we managed it. I think we did it, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I always enjoy those sorts of things. No, as I said before, in our last conversation, you definitely pulled some storytelling jujitsu in the last third of the book, I want to say. So I'm very curious where you go with it now.
So the thing that we're really hoping that people will sort of have as their reaction when they read The Liar's Knot and also with the third book is, because this was something that we went in from the start with much more of a plan than either of us normally has with our books, there is a lot of stuff that we kind of hope anybody who chooses to reread later on is going to go, oh my God, that was there from the start.
Yeah. There's a lot of early clues and crumbs that we give that are probably things that people won't pick up on until they know what's going on, and then they could be like,
because it's annoying when you read a series where it's like, okay, there was this really satisfying plot for the first book, and then what happens in books 2 and 3 feels like it kind of got pulled out of the author's ear, and we're like, no, we had that planned.
Yeah, I like that approach because I'm a big fan of that myself, and I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's or when you can even extend this further, when the author did their successful series that made their name to start with, and then they need to do a sequel series, and so they have to come up with an equally dangerous villain for the second series, even though we've heard nothing about this particular bad guy in the first series. That's why I actually laid the groundwork for that in the Inheritance Cycle for some future stories, even though it sometimes felt like it was a side storyline that should have been cut. I had this conversation with my editor. I was like, no, this is going to be important later on.
We actually kind of have that too. It's not that we were planning a sequel series from the start, but
we looked at a particular thing and went, God, that would make a really good story, but it's not a story we can tell in this.
Yeah. There's definitely something which is in the backstory of the setting that we have made, some passing mentions to, and so it's just kind of there. If we get the chance to do another series, which we certainly hope we'll be able to do, that can be the thing we pick up and go, all right, now let's deal with that.
Well, I think one thing people can definitely take away from listening to both of you talk about this so passionately and eloquently is that approaching world building is definitely something one can do, not only from a place of passion, but you can be quite, I don't want to say mechanistic, but you can be quite disciplined about it also. And I think the more you do it, the more practice you get. It's like, oh, well, we're going to have the religious arena here. We're going to have the magical arena here. We're going to have physics here. We're going to have culture. We're going to have costumes. We're going to have geography. And, you can break it down fairly fine-grained if you want, but you can also tackle it in large bins and then see how the pieces interact.
And I would say the passion for me still shows up there in the, like, where you choose to kind of center the story. What are the things that you are going to be diving in on? Like, this is one of the places where collaboration helps us, that I kind of don't give a shit about economics. Like, I've just never been, but Alyc loves that. And so, like...
And I'm not so much into language, like it's there, I use it, but Maria's like definitely the linguist of us, the common person.
Yeah, so it's the, you're still going to be writing the stories that are focusing on the bits that you are the most excited about. Like, you don't have to cover all the bases. No book is ever going to cover all of the bases. You dive, and I mean, you see this with like Tolkien, that he loved language and he loved history and myth, but don't ask the economics of that world, or like, how does anybody outside the Shire get fed?
And he liked describing the hobbits tromping through the fields.
Yes.
That was his favorite thing to write. When I wrote Aragon, I really knew I should have come up with like names for the seasons and invented holidays and the whole calendar and everything, and I just hated it for some reason at that point. I never did it, and it's bugged me to this day that I never did it. And that's actually why I'm looking forward to like creating a new fantasy book at some point where I kind of get to take all these tools, some of which I think I definitely haven't been inspired by reading your world building books, and having fun with it from scratch, so to speak, because you learn from every book.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I will say for people who are like thinking about world building and stuff, because one of the big questions I know that will come up for almost any author is, when do you stop? right?
Yes.
Like, when do you stop and start writing? And I will say that, like, so for example, the not having like the days and calendars and seasons and everything, if it's not important for the story, or if you're not making it important for the story, because it can be a kind of thing where you're like, I'm going to focus on this because it's something I'm interested in, I'm going to make some story around it, like Tolkien did, then, you know, you don't have to create the entire world. You have to create the world that you're telling the story in, by which I mean it's the part of the, so yes, because I've talked to people who are like spending so much time building their world that a lot of it might not be necessary.
Well, and it may sound like we did all of this world building. We did a larger than usual chunk of world building before we began, but huge chunks of it are also things where, like, okay, we got to this point in the story and we're like, all right, we need some kind of holiday to be going on here because we want our characters out on the street with something interesting happening around them. Let's make up a holiday.
Yeah.
So a lot of it does get built in response to the story.
Yeah, and to kind of what we need, and we can go back to what we've already got and say, okay, what fits in with the rest of this that we've already kind of constructed. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap things up on, a bit of hope for aspiring authors who are getting lost in their world building. Which, you know, if world building is what you really want to do and nothing else, then what you should do is write game manuals, like, you know, Dungeons and Dragons manuals. It's just pure world building from start to finish.
Make a setting for a game, and then get somebody to design the game for you.
Game settings are a lot of fun. Yeah.
So where can everyone find you out on the wild web or elsewhere?
My website is swantower.com, and I'm on Twitter as swan_tower, because without the underscore was already taken.
And I'm Alyc Helms everywhere. So yeah, on Twitter and website and everything like that.
And
then together.
Yeah, we've got macarrick.com, and then ma_Carrick, because again, problems getting the name we wanted, on Twitter. And I will say, by the way, we've got a pattern reading widget up on our site and some articles that do kind of unpack the world building in a more expository way. And we're also working on making an astrology widget so that you can kind of get your horoscope under their calendar, because we put in a character in the story, we're like, she's an astrologer. Shit, now we need to figure out how the astrology
Now we need to do an astrology system.
Yeah.
But luckily we had Numenatria, and so we could go in and kind of, you know,
build it off that. Yeah.
Awesome.
So there's fun things to play with on the site.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we'll put the links up for that so people can go check that out. Well, this has been a really amazing conversation. I know we got pretty deep in the weeds there, but hopefully folks find that as interesting as I did.
Weeds are where you find the interesting beetles or something. I don't know.
That's right. That's right. Well, first you have to decide what kind of weeds they are and whether or not they're native or invasive and whether or not we're on an Earth-like planet. Anyway, we're going down the rabbit hole again, although we don't know if it's actually a rabbit.
Does this world actually have weeds?
Now, that's a philosophical question, I feel.
Yeah, because I feel weed is a category defined by culture.
Yeah, what is the category of the weed? Yeah.
That's right.
God,
it's something your dog isn't allowed to eat.
I had philosophical arguments with my mom when I was growing up, because I was my sister and I were shanghaied into helping weed the garden, and I was being annoying to her, I think, and I was arguing the definition of weed back then. I didn't win that argument, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, parents get a little bit of a because I said so, like, you know, instant win card.
They do. They do. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for the wonderful conversation. We'll have to do this again when book 2 comes out.
Be delighted to.
So, again, thank you everyone for watching. Please go read The Mask of Mirrors and their other books, and check out their social media. And we will be back soon.